Hey there, and welcome back to Start Adventuring, a channel dedicated to empowering new roleplayers to break down their barriers and just start adventuring. I'm Baxter.
And I'm Ben. And this is our very first Homebrew Book Club episode dedicated to The Curse of Strahd, which is an adventure that Baxter and I have wanted to run for a long time, and we've talked a lot about co-DMing it. So we thought we'd do as a series here on YouTube, us talking through elements of the adventure to really formulate our version of the campaign. If you're someone who wants to run this adventure, or you're just interested in the idea of how you homebrew an adventure to really kind of make it your own, that's what we're doing with these homebrew book clubs, and we'd love to have your input as we're building this campaign. This episode will be particularly focused on Strahd as a character. We're looking mostly from like a role play and a story perspective, and especially trying to dial in on what makes a good BBEG, big bad evil guy, for your campaign. A villain for your story. It's the most important thing, especially in an adventure like Curse of Strahd, which I think the big selling point is that you have your bad guy, and it's clear that you have this force that you have to overcome. I think that's why a lot of earlier DMs and earlier players find Curse of Strahd so accessible, because the objective is so clear. So Baxter and I are just going to kind of go back and forth talking about what's in the adventure for Strahd and how we can kind of make it our own, hopefully inspiring you to make things your own too and get out there and start adventuring. Yeah. Before we start, if you enjoy what we do here at Start Adventuring, if you enjoy this video, please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel. It does a great deal for us here on YouTube. I'm going to take a sip from my mug of vanishing, and we'll get started.
I get my Star Wars blueprint mug today.
Oh, no, don't say Star Wars. We'll get demonetized.
Oh, well, we're not monetized anyway, so for right now...
Yeah, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, Baxter, so... we both read the section from the first chapter regarding Strahd's backstory, and over here we've listed out kind of the main points. You have Strahd the Conqueror having taken over Barovia with their father, who was a great conqueror before him. Then you have this tragedy that happens with Strahd being obsessed with Tatiana, a woman from Barovia, and that leading to the death of Strahd's brother and Strahd becoming a vampire and all of this. And then you have afterward centuries of this curse falling on Strahd, keeping people stuck in Barovia. That's what's written. How do you feel about that for our Strahd?
So one thing that I think we talked about and we wanted to do for our Strahd, that is something that's kind of different, but it just kind of fits maybe a little bit more in the idea of the times and you know what we want to do, is we would like our Strahd to be a Lady Strahd, specifically kind of designed around, if any of you have played Resident Evil Village, something akin to Lady Dimitrescu.
Yeah, let's be honest. I don't know if it's even about matching with the times as much as it's just like, oh, cool, this is a vampire lady, and well, I think...
you know what it is for me? It's more about that, at least in a lot of the modules that I read for, or I have read, there's not a lot of female representation on either side of the like hero. I mean, player characters are the hero, but you know, some of the more entrenched NPCs. And I just think it would be interesting, not that it really changes too much narratively one way or the other, but especially Strahd, who is viewed as this, you know, strong conqueror that has this vice grip on the land. You know, it's an interesting kind of, you know, a different take on it. And I thought it would be kind of interesting too, like I said, those kind of current pop culture icons of that vampiric Lady Dimitrescu, or even just, you know, more of a balanced narrative of how they came to be. When specifically, like, you know, the life before the tragedy, when we speak of a conqueror, you know, who comes to mind for me are icons like Joan of Arc, or, you know, Game of Thrones, Brienne of Tarth, kind of this idea of strength, but
and Cersei Lannister, not for
and
nothing,
Cersei Lannister, sure. I think almost a migration from Brienne of Tarth into a Cersei Lannister kind of figure, and specifically too, not to go too fast down our list, but in the sense of death of a loved one, in a similar vein of Cersei Lannister, I think it would be more interesting not to have it be this character that Strahd lusted after, Tatiana, but maybe the death of their family member is what kind of sends them into this dark place. I think that's more human. Though Strahd is maybe not supposed to be superhuman, I think there needs to be human elements before and during the fact to kind of help that narrative stick with some of the players.
Well, and not just with the players, but with the DM. Like, for me, yeah. I'm thinking about Strahd as written is this, like, hyper-patriarchal figure, this warrior king who takes all the consorts from the surrounding village. Like, none of that stuff is super fun for me. I don't really like the idea of playing that villain as much. So I definitely, whether it's a male or a female Strahd, I think tweaking those sort of story elements to make Strahd, this domineering force, but to give them a motivation that's maybe less like, I need my heir to the Von Zarovich kingdom,
right,
and I need the soul of my, deserved woman that I was supposed to get. Like,
it's a little, all, yeah.
Unless you're, like, really trying to lean into that because it's like, wow, I know my party is gonna hate this guy. I guess that's fine. That's one way to do it. And I think that's the way that I would do it if I was running it more as written. But to your point, like, I would rather make a Strahd who is maybe not sympathetic in the moment, but whose story is sympathetic and understandable. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, some level of, something that makes a good villain, in my opinion. If we look at some, classic successful villains of the current modern era, there's always something that is relatable, or a minor sense of humanity that we can at least look at and attribute, like, okay, well, maybe they started off with good intentions, or they started off in a place that is, pseudo-logical, but then somewhere something happened, the tragedy, or, something that caused them to divert from this path that maybe was started off in a good place, or started off in a place of good intention, into where the players enter now, which has become this really corrupt, dark, bad place. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as it were.
Right. And I think that, like, Strahd as written could play into that if it's really more about, like, he really loved Tatiana, but Tatiana was in love with Sergei, and Strahd accepted that from a place of being a good person, but then couldn't bear it anymore, made this pact in order to... But then it's got to be a sort of different event, not just like, oh, I kill my brother, chase this woman, and get killed by the guards, because as written, it's just like, okay, Strahd is just a bad dude.
Right. There's not a lot of redeeming qualities in his actions, at least up after, like, once he becomes the king, it seems like he already has lost his head, and he's kind of got this weird notion of, like, ownership over this person. Like, there's a lot of, like, missteps that I think, especially in modern culture, if we look at it, it's just not the right messaging, not the right signal, at least for me and for what I would run in a game.
I also just don't think that, like, my players would respond to that. Like,
no,
you don't want to have... Because, again, one of the fun elements of this adventure as written is Strahd shows up, Strahd can show up anywhere. And Strahd kind of... It's in the chapter at the end, they talk about how, Strahd can show up and have little encounters and toy with the party, and maybe he's trying to tempt the party to join him, maybe, stuff like that.
Right.
I don't think any of that sort of fun stuff is possible if I personally, as the DM, think Strahd is just an evil, reprehensible, terrible character. You know what I mean?
And it also, to some degree, loses its punch a little bit. If Strahd is just an evil person with evil intentions with no redemption, there's not really a reason, unless your player characters are also evil or like one track in that regard, that they would want to side with them or would want to do anything with them. I think there has to be this kind of level of relatability so that if that is posed as a option for the player characters, they might have some incentive to take it. They might have some level of sympathy to connect to it that would entice them to do that. Like we said, I mean, in terms of, we talked a little bit about this in our planning for this. One of the things that I brought up is in the intro to the campaign, which we were going to cover in a more detail in another video. But I thought it could be interesting if the player characters are literally on their way with an invitation to the Ravenloft for a kind of commensurate ball to try and bring in all of this talent to help Strahd get out of the demi-plane.
Yeah, even if that's a trick of some kind.
Even if that's a trick of some kind, absolutely. And again, we're going to cover that specific topic, the idea of how to start the campaign, where to kind of bring it in a different video, so I won't go any too far down that rabbit hole. But the idea is, I think that what would make this almost more interesting is to have Strahd stand almost as a Thanos-like character, not to throw too many pop culture references back to back to back, but, this idea that there is kind of this big, mighty character that has a goal, and you can either help them, or you can get out of the way.
Yeah.
But if you stand in the way, they might destroy you.
Yeah, which is why Strahd, as written as this kind of apathetic, sort of disaffected character, may not be interesting. Again, if you're really leaning into, wow, this is a reprehensible character, fine. I mean, maybe that's the kind of campaign that's going to work at your table. And this module, as written, does a really good job of setting up Strahd as just a very scary force with not a lot of redeeming qualities, and you could run it just as written if you think that's going to work. But I think, as Baxter's writing, Strahd has to be a compelling villain. Yeah, exactly as Baxter just wrote, in my opinion. So it's either he is compelling because he is so reprehensible, but for me, it's more fun if it's a little bit more complicated than that, especially because Baxter and I tend to play D&D games that are more role-play heavy, which means the story and the kind of motivations around the characters have to go beyond just like, that's a bad guy, we gotta kill that guy.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Two, I mean, the way that I think about it is, and it's a common thing within modules as written. With this one, it's a little bit different. So what I would kind of attribute to, like, if you look at, again, Icewind Dale, which is a book that I am running currently, when you look at the roleplay for Arl, it talks about how Arl can only act in malice or in, like, the most, like, she wants to make the lives of everyone difficult. And that's really because she is a goddess and, like, stuck in her own like, that's how she is. Like, I think that almost has a different level of variance, and you have to kind of learn how to play with that in a way that she acts that way, but maybe to different ends, if that makes any sense.
Right, but
Strahd
is not a cosmic force.
Exactly. So, like, I think that the other thing that I would say in making Strahd a compelling villain is Strahd isn't necessarily so set in stone the way that how to roleplay Strahd is kind of written out. I really don't think you need to have Strahd only be, this kind of evil, crazed, they feel as though, they want to find an heir, but nobody but a Von Zarovich is worth it, so, like, they kind of think the players could be it, but not really. Like, I think that there is a lot more worth in making
Give
it
Strahd a real purpose for
Exactly.
the players. I
Right.
think is a key. I would put that
in
notes
notes.
for later, because I think and that kind of goes toward what we were talking about with starting the adventure. But like, Strahd should have a clear purpose, which he does as written. He's got his obsession with this woman Irina, who he thinks is like the resurrected reincarnation of his love, right? And then there's also a vampire hunter, Von Richten,
Right,
who is
who's
around,
hidden away,
and
yeah.
Strahd is trying to root them out. Those are good. I also think how your players interact with that, though, this is the thing that I think throws a lot of people off, or would throw me off, is that while Curse of Strahd has really clear objectives, it's written as a sandbox.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah.
I think that like giving a little bit more structure to what's going on is actually a helpful endeavor. But we're kind of getting off the topic of
Right.
Strahd's
That would be more, again, in that video of how we're gonna start. But it's not, you're not wrong, and I think it all starts with who Strahd is, right? Because that is the jumping off point for the campaign. That is the, as you said, the big bad for the entire adventure. And I think really what it's going to come down to is if you can make Strahd more compelling than just an evil person sitting on top of a throne at the end of the adventure.
Right. I think the sort of starting place for me is that I think Strahd is a person, or was a person before they became an undead, sort of centuries old, sad person. But Strahd's key thing, as written, is that they feel they are in charge of their destiny, and they do what they have to do for the sort of bringing to fruition of their vision of what should be, you know? And I think that fits, even if you're playing it with a more sympathetic Strahd, even if it's more like this Joan of Arc character. I also like the idea of a more martial Strahd rather than a more sort of wizard-like Strahd.
Right, yeah, we talked about this.
We are going to potentially do a video all about sort of Strahd's stat block,
right, like
and
the mechanics
combat
of
encounters.
Strahd.
That's not really what we're talking about in this video. But I think a more martial Strahd, like leaning into the military prowess of Strahd, is interesting.
I agree with that, especially like the strategic element of Strahd, because I think that's, I mean, part of Strahd in the campaign is that they are kind of this, you know, master strategist, mind games. They're the, you know, knocking on the door to try and get in, because, you know, as a vampire, they can't enter any place without being invited. Which is, I think, a totally fun element that the DM should play with. You know, and I think, you know, obviously the entire crux of this campaign and who Strahd is, if you strip away everything, is a vampire, right? And so you can play with exactly how that looks, but that is also something that should be taken into consideration, is that this is very much a gothic horror vampire campaign. And really, no matter what way you skin Strahd, that is the core ethos of the character.
I think for me, too, the other thing that I'd want to clarify running this campaign is what is the deal that Strahd actually made, and why? And what are these forces that gave Strahd this power, you know? Because the interesting thing to me is that there is this tension, right? Like, Barovia isn't being held by Strahd. Strahd is trying to figure out how to break the curse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And one thing that I think would actually be interesting is, I think it would be if Strahd, essentially because of the emotions felt from the death of the loved one, they put themselves in the demiplane. And maybe the only way to get out of it is if Strahd dies, or if the players can help Strahd through their grief. Similar to a, you know, WandaVision meets Frozen. I know I do a lot of pop culture references. I love cinema.
That's
it's
how
a
we're
great
informed
way.
in what we're doing.
That makes
sense
how
to me.
I...
You know, that's pretty interesting, because the other thing is Strahd can think that they actually are the person who caused the person who died to be reborn as this other person. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
So maybe Strahd thinks it's not about like, oh, this is the, this person is the one I wanted to have as my queen, and so I'm gonna get this other one because that's just, I don't know. Not only is it icky, it's just also kind of
it doesn't
makes
feel
Strahd out to be kind of a lame character.
No
you know what I mean?
No one would support that. No healthy individual would support that behavior. But if it was like the way that I see it, the death of the loved one, I think it's 1,000 times more interesting if it's the death of the brother, or if you want to change it to a sister or whatever, that created this, hole in Strahd, essentially. And so then again, maybe it's not the loved one, the romantic interest that's been reincarnated. Maybe it's the family member. And it's this idea that, there's a whole part of it where, in the adventure you have to find the specific things to help you defeat Strahd. Maybe, yes, you get the sword, the sun sword or whatever to defeat Strahd, but also like maybe the book and the I believe it's the amulet, whatever the specific components are, maybe those can help inform the players of why this all happened. And they can go, well, hey, put the pieces together. Maybe if we help Strahd through the grief, this will end.
Sure. I think there's also, so let's get specific about it. So in the story as written, what happens? Strahd becomes the ruler of Barovia, and then gets concerned about losing power or something, and so they begin to experiment with dark forces. And unrelated to that, they have this brother who who is coddled by Strahd's mother. Oh, right. So Strahd makes a pact with the dark forces to live forever, because when their dad dies, Strahd is like, I don't want to die. That's less interesting to me. I feel like it would be better if it's something more along the lines of, maybe Strahd is protective of the brother as well. You know what I mean? Or sister, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, the way that I see it is, again, maybe it's a way for them to preserve the life. Like, they did it for themselves as a kind of trial run, and then their plan was to turn everybody in the family. Or something. Yeah,
because the shock of the death of the
patriarch,
king.
Or you could even have it be a major. Like, that's the other thing that, and again, I think that's part of the reason that I'm saying if I were running it, I think I would have a feminine Strahd, is that I think that the genders of all of these people completely interchangeable, and I think you should have fun and play with it to whatever your table would respond the best to, or you as the DM would respond the best to.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think that it sort of also gets away from this weird, like, Strahd as incel or some weird thing, you know what I mean? It's just, I mean, again, unless you're just trying to make a sniveling villain, but I think the power of Strahd as a campaign villain is the imposing nature and the power that they have. So, like, tying that to this very, like, I think weak kind of personality that's suggested by the backstory as written is weird.
Agreed. Right. I think at the times, maybe it was just more, this is an evil person. We don't like them. They're not supposed to like him. He's evil. But I think there's a more creative and kind of expounding way that you can do this that adds a level of humanity and a level of another layer to the storytelling that I think would be, especially because Strahd is so instrumental in the campaign as a whole, it would be more interesting to most tables. But again,
maybe there was like some kind of golden age or something where Strahd was a righteous
great
ruler.
leader. Yeah, totally.
And actually then whatever the jeopardy, maybe the brother found themselves, the brother or sister, the sibling, the younger sibling, the protected one, right, found themselves in some kind of jeopardy, and that's why Strahd began to experiment with immortality,
Sure.
with dark forces.
Maybe they got sick. Maybe they got sick. Maybe, there's a lot of different ways that you can spin it. But I think having them turn to the dark for protective or kind of
it's
a more interesting, a more interesting purpose other than self-preservation, I think again adds a level of humanity and adds a level of, hey, maybe there's hope for Strahd.
Because then you get the sense that these 100 years of being an undead, alone, orphaned, despised ruler actually changed Strahd. That's how you get the Strahd that the players meet.
Right.
But making a difference between the Strahd that the players meet and the Strahd who was in their prime as the ruler and the leader of Barovia, I think is interesting. It also adds value to learning the lore. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
There's actually a reason to understand the character, the villain.
Exactly, and the story that brought not just the players there realistically, but Strahd to this point. So I think in the notes I'm going to say, play with why Strahd became I guess that's the entire point of the video, became a vampire specifically in this situation.
Yes, exactly.
Fell to the darkness.
Yeah, and specifically, what was the deal? Was it just for immortality? That's fine. Was it to preserve Sergei's life or whatever you choose for Strahd's sibling? Was it to protect Sergei? I mean, maybe the dark forces, maybe this is just a random idea. Maybe Strahd has a brother or sister and maybe Sergei had a lover who was a man who was secretly a vampire or something. Do you know what I mean? And Strahd recognized that this person was an agent of dark forces and tried to contact the superior of this, tried to protect Sergei in some way, and ended up getting, screwed over in this transaction.
Maybe Strahd killed the, vampire lover, and in the vampire lover's last breath, bit Strahd, and Strahd became a vampire, and the grief of all of this caused the sibling to take their own life. And then that is the, again, that's maybe a little bit triggering for some people, and that might not be the absolute best, but...
Trigger warning for Curse of Strahd.
Yeah, it's
you
definitely...
don't necessarily need to make it a suicide thing, because, check on that with your table.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be as dark. Even though it's gothic horror, even though it's vampires, it doesn't have to be extremely dark and evil and traumatizing. It can be. I understand that there are some tables where that's part of the fun,
what they want,
right? But that's not really what we like.
And it's not, it's just not super, it's not absolutely essential to the telling of this story. If you want to change any of it to be...
Something tragic happened to somebody that Strahd loved, and simultaneously, their kingdom became a prison, and their people turned against them. I mean, maybe the sibling was beloved by the people of Barovia, and even in the time that Strahd was well-liked as a ruler, when the sibling died, when this whatever the tragic event was, and Strahd became this vampire, the people of Barovia went, oh no, now we're stuck here because of this person. And so the hundreds of years of Strahd being that person has changed who Strahd is now.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yes. I think that it's so essentially just to kind of give again a summary, and then we'll kind of go into our close for this particular video. Who is Strahd? They are, at least as written, a conqueror who had the death of a loved one, which caused them to be now stuck in this demi-plane as a vampire, due to either choices that they made for whatever their motivations are. Our notes for how we would kind of influence or say things to keep in mind is to make sure that Strahd is a compelling villain, as they are pivotal and essential in the entire adventure. having Strahd have a real and clear purpose for the the PCs in order to kind of have it be so that, there is some level of actual choice that the player characters can have in their allegiance or disallegiance, I guess, if that's a word, to Strahd.
And they have a purpose to be involved.
Right,
Do you know what I mean?
There's some
because I think
element at play.
very open-ended sandbox adventures, especially if you're a newer DM or you have a newer table, this is a really popular adventure. But you may run into trouble trying to run it with the book if you don't kind of clarify things and make it a little bit more linear and directional for yourself.
Yeah. So play with why Strahd became a vampire or fell to the darkness, whether it's from protection or, something. It could be self-preservation, but, I would encourage you to think if that's something that would, resonate with the players, or if you want to have it be that way, just to kind of reinforce that evil nature, completely up to you as the DM as you prep the adventure. But again, the big question for that is, what was the deal? Was it you will become a vampire so that you can protect XYZ, or so that you can become the most powerful thing? Maybe there's 1,000 different ways that you could spin it, but that's kind of the main crux and the main question in how Strahd became a vampire.
And I think you should get specific with that in your own homebrewing of this adventure, because I think as written, it's a little bit unclear what the connection is, right?
Yeah.
Strahd is looking into dark powers to be immortal. Also, he's jealous of his brother. Then he drinks his brother's blood, and that's how he ends up
a vampire.
It's
there's a lot of steps there that feels disjointed almost.
Yeah. So the whole point of this is do whatever you want with it. This adventure is great because it's got a clear villain. Now make a villain that you're excited to run. Don't just try to... It's not necessary, and it'll be less fun for you to memorize what's in the book and say, well, that's what it is, so that's what it's got to be. Take what works for you and transform it into a villain you're excited to run. Because I think Baxter and I, it sounds like our Strahd is going to be a Joan of Arc, Brienne of Tarth, martial conqueror, who was a fair and just leader, almost more so than her father or mother, whatever we want to say, the ruler before, but fell to the darkness trying to preserve their family.
Right.
And the peace in Barovia, and sort of became this almost tragic figure hundreds of years ago. So they appear much worse now, as
time has worn on them. But at the end of the day, too, the thing that I really think is the crux of this is, as written, Strahd is as plain as day, just an evil, kind of lost, no hope for them individual. And you could play it like that if you think that's if your players are just kind of like, I want to go slay some vampire. But if you're looking for something maybe a little bit more role play, or a little bit more, a couple different ways it can turn out, so to speak, really adding levels of depth at any level of Strahd is going to be the key to kind of transforming them from a, lost, hopeless, kind of gross individual into something that might be a little bit more redeemable, or at the very least someone that the players can empathize or sympathize with.
Yeah, and I think a lot of DMs pick up this adventure and want to make Strahd sympathetic, and they look to do it in the role-playing of Strahd, right?
Sure.
How you characterize Strahd in the moment. But I would say, too, really dig into that backstory and change it. You can make them into a sympathetic but lost character. And you don't have to be a great actor or something. Do it in your prep,
Exactly.
It doesn't have to come just from your own charisma. So hopefully this conversation inspired you to make a Strahd or a BBEG for your campaign that you really love. I'm excited to keep talking about this book too. And thanks for the great discussion, Baxter.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think, that'll kind of wrap us up? Do you have any lasting thoughts? Anything else you feel like we need to add before we sign off?
Nope. Just be excited about your
Yeah.
NPCs. Don't take what's in the book and take what gets you excited and turn it into a campaign you love. Because at the end of the day, that's all homebrewing is about. And you
Exactly.
can homebrew from pre-written modules. That's the whole purpose of Homebrew Book Club.
Exactly.
So, thanks for watching this discussion. We hope you found it inspirational and interesting and that you have your wheels turning about your campaign's BBEG or your prep for Strahd. If you enjoyed the video, please do click that little button down there, that like button. It seems like a little thing, but it does a lot for us here on YouTube. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We'd love to have you be a part of the Start Adventuring community, and it also helps boost the visibility of these videos.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big, huge shout out to our founding patron, Gilbert Got a Game. Love them, love everything they're doing, supporting us for as little as $1 a month, or as much as $1 a month for Ben and I. You can join Gilbert Got a Game over at our Patreon, the link to which will be in the description box below. But regardless, we just love that you guys are here and giving us your time. We appreciate you all so much. But again, big shout out to Gilbert Got a Game.
And hey, let's keep this book club discussion going.
Absolutely.
Best part about a book club is it's a discussion. So if you've got thoughts about villains or about Curse of Strahd, Strahd in general, let us know in the comments down below. Let's keep talking. But until next time, I'm Ben.
And I'm Baxter. And remember, start adventuring.
Just start adventuring.